Sword and sorcery is a subgenre of fantasy generally characterized by sword-wielding heroes engaged in exciting and violent conflicts. An element of romance is often present, as is an element of magic and the supernatural. Unlike works of high fantasy, the tales, though dramatic, focus mainly on personal battles rather than world-endangering matters. Sword and sorcery commonly overlaps with heroic fantasy, a film genre tangentially related to sword and sorcery, at least in name, is sword and sandal, though its subjects are generally oriented to biblical times and early history instead of fantasy, not to be confused with cloak and dagger or cloak and sword, which are alternate genres. Origin: the term sword and sorcery was first coined in 1961 when the British author Michael Moorcock published a letter in the fanzine Amra, demanding a name for the sort of fantasy adventure story written by Robert E. Howard. He had initially proposed the term epic fantasy. However, the celebrated American sword and sorcery author Fritz Leiber replied in the journal An Carligan suggesting, "Sword and sorcery is a good popular catchphrase for the field." He expanded on this in the July 1961 issue of Amra, commenting, "I feel more certain than ever that this field should be called the sword and sorcery story. This accurately describes the points of culture level and supernatural element and also immediately distinguishes it from the cloak and sword story, and from the cloak and dagger story too." Fritz Leiber, Amra, July 1961. Though not explicitly mentioned in Leiber's letter, the originally Italian film genre known as sword and sandal, depicting heroic adventures in settings derived from the Bible or Greek mythology, was at the peak of its popularity in the US at the time when the letter was written. Since its inception, many attempts have been made to redefine precisely what sword and sorcery is. Although many have debated the finer points, the consensus characterizes it by a strong bias toward fast-paced, action-rich tales set within a quasi-mythical or fantastical framework. Unlike high fantasy, the stakes in sword and sorcery tend to be personal, the danger confined to the moment of telling. Settings are typically exotic, and protagonists often morally compromised. Many sword and sorcery tales have been turned into a lengthy series of adventures. The lower stakes and less than world-threatening dangers make this more plausible than a repetition of the perils of epic fantasy. So too does the nature of the heroes. Most sword and sorcery protagonists, travelers by nature, find peace after adventure deathly dull. At one extreme, the heroes of E.R. Edison's The Worm Ouroboros grieve for the end of the war and that they have no more foes equal to those they defeated. In answer to their prayers, the gods restore the enemy city so that they can fight the same war over again. Seminal works. The genre has been defined strongly by the work of Robert E. Howard, particularly his tales of Conan the Barbarian and Cull of Atlantis, mostly in Weird Tales from 1932 and 1929 respectively. Other books and series that define the genre of sword and sorcery include Clark Ashton Smith's Hyperborean and Zodiac Tales, beginning with The Tale of Satamper Zyros, and The Empire of the Necromancers in 1931 and 1932, respectively. C.L. Moore's Jarell of Joy Tales, beginning with Black God's Kiss, which introduced the first notable sword and sorcery heroine. Fritz Leiber's FAFHRD and the Grey Mauser sequence, beginning with Two Swords Adventure. Michael Moorcock's Elric sequence, beginning with The Dreaming City, notable for its adherence to counter-stereotype. L. Sprague de Camp's Swords and Sorcery, the first sword and sorcery anthology, Pyramid Books, December 1963. Carl Edward Wagner's K novels, beginning with Darkness Weaves, credited with reinvigorating the genre. Robert Lynn Aspran's Thieves' World, a series of shared world anthologies first created in 1978. Samuel R. Delany's Return of Everyone, a series of 3 story collections and 1 novel influenced by critical theory, published from 1979 to 1987. Charles Saunders' I Marrow novels, beginning with I Marrow, a collection of short stories first published in the 70s for dark fantasy fanzine, notable for being the first notable black sword and sorcery protagonist. Other pulp fantasy fiction, such as Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom series and Lee Brackett's Sea Kings of Mars, have a similar feel to sword and sorcery. But, because alien science replaces the supernatural, it is usually described as planetary romance, a sword and planet, and considered to fall more in the area of science fiction. Despite this, planetary romance is closely aligned with sword and sorcery, and the work of Burroughs, Brackett, and others in the former field have been significant in creating and spreading S&An proper. Sword and sorcery itself has often blurred the lines between fantasy and science fiction, drawing elements from both, like the weird fiction it sprang from. Revival. For the 1960s up till the 1980s, under the guiding force of Lin Carter, a select group of writers formed the Swordsmen and Sorcerers Guild of America to promote and enlarge the sword and sorcery genre. From 1973 to 1981, 5 anthologies featuring short works by saga members were published, edited by Carter. These were collectively known as Flashing Swords. Because of these and other anthologies, his own fiction, and his criticism, Carter is considered one of the most important popularizers of genre fantasy in general, and S&An in particular. Another notable sword and sorcery anthology series that ran from 1977 through 1979 was called Swords Against Darkness, and was edited by Andrew J. Offert. This series ran to 5 volumes and featured stories by such authors as Poul Anderson, David Drake, Ramsey Campbell, Andre Norton, and Manly Wade Wellman. Despite such authors' best efforts, sword and sorcery has more colloquially come to be known as a catch-all phrase for low-grade, derivative fantasy as well as fiction written in such universes. During the 1980s, influenced by the success of the 1982 feature film Conan the Barbarian, many cheaply made fantasy films were released that came to be derisively known as sword and sorcery. The term is sometimes used in a derogatory manner by writers and readers of the fantasy genre. After the boom of the early 1980s, sword and sorcery once again dropped out of favor, with epic fantasy largely taking its place in the fantasy genre. However, there was another resurgence in sword and sorcery at the end of the 20th century, sometimes called the new or literary sword and sorcery. This development places emphasis on literary technique, and draws from epic fantasy and other genres to broaden the typical scope of S&An. Stories may feature the wide-ranging struggles, national or world-spanning concerns common to high fantasy, but told from the point of view of characters more common to S&An, and with the sense of adventure common to the latter. Writers associated with this include Stephen Erickson, Joe Abercrombie, and Scott Lynch, and magazines such as Blackgate and the e-zines Flashing Swords and Beneath Ceaseless Skies publish short fiction in the style. These authors and editors are attempting to return the genre to the status it enjoyed during the pulp era of the 20s and 30s. Women creators and characters. Despite the importance of C.L. Moore, Lee Brackett, Andre Norton, and other female authors, as well as Moore's early heroine, Sword and Sorcery has been characterized as having a strongly masculine bias. Female characters were generally distressed damsels to be rescued or protected, or otherwise served as an inducement or reward for a male hero's adventures. Women who had adventures of their own often did so to counter the threat of rape, or to gain revenge for same. Marion Zimmer Bradley's Sword and Sorceress anthology series attempted the reverse. Bradley encouraged female writers and protagonists. The stories feature skillful swordswomen and powerful sorceresses, working from a variety of motives. The series was immensely popular, and Bradley was editing her final volume at the time of her death. Jessica Amanda Salmonson similarly sought to broaden the range of roles for female characters in S&An through both her own stories and in editing. The World Fantasy Award-winning Amazons and Amazons 2 anthologies both drew on real and folkloric women warriors, often from areas outside of Europe. Today, active female characters who participate equally with the male heroes in the stories are a regular feature in modern sword and sorcery stories. Early sword and sorcery writer Robert E. Howard had feminist views despite his era and location, which he espoused in both personal and professional life. Howard wrote to his friends and associates defending the achievements and capabilities of women. Strong female characters in Howard's works of fiction include the proto-feminist Dark Agnes de Chastillon, the early modern pirate Helen Tavril, as well as two pirates and Conan the Barbarian supporting characters, Bulletin Valeria of the Red Brotherhood, introduced as a minor character in a non-fantasy historical story by Howard, The Shadow of the Vulture. Red Sonja of Rogotino would later inspire a fantasy heroine named Red Sonja, who first appeared in the comic book series Conan the Barbarian, written by Roy Thomas and illustrated by Barry Windsor Smith. Red Sonja received her own comic book title and eventually a series of novels by David C. Smith and Richard L. Tierney, as well as Richard Fleisch's unsuccessful film adaptation in 1985.